Here's a suggestion for the religious. Instead of trying to con people into buying into your religious crap, maybe you ought to just try being honest for once. Maybe you ought to actually use rational, skeptical, and critical thought-out methods for determining if your beliefs are actually reasonable. Yeah, we know they won't because they could never come to those conclusions, and that's kind of a problem if you think about it. But they can't. They just can't. They won't. And this is just one more example of their failures. So, it should come as absolutely no surprise that I'm not a fan of J. Warner Wallace. I don't know anybody who actually is. He's kind of a dumbass. I'm not a fan of any apologists, though, because they're all really doing the exact same thing, and most of them seem utterly oblivious to it. It's why watching them try to sell their work to people is so entertaining, because it gives us an opportunity to point out all of the things that they're doing wrong. And they're doing an awful lot wrong, as you will see. So let's go watch Wallace completely screw absolutely everything up. Because what else can he do? He's running the course completely backwards and then declaring victory, and that's utterly dumb. Okay, I just wanted to stop here for a second to point out something that should be pretty obvious. Wallace was a homicide detective. He's not any longer. He is a former homicide detective. Nobody pays him for that anymore. And let's be honest, if he was as piss poor at that as he is at apologetics, well, that's not exactly a surprise that he's no longer working in that field. So, continuing to advertise yourself as an active crime scene investigator is both dishonest and misleading. It kind of says an awful lot about his character, doesn't it?
What can we do to help someone who has a liberal theology that doesn't believe in the authority of Scripture?
Now, this video was really referred to me by someone who said that it was trying to convince atheists that the New Testament was reliable, and that's not quite the case. The question here refers to people with a very liberal theology. How about people with no theology at all? You know, like atheists. But that's something that Wallace won't really address because he's just running off of a script. And if you want my answer, here you go. I would be convinced if you could present evidence, objectively verifiable, independently testable evidence that showed that the New Testament, or any part of the Bible for that matter, could stand up to investigation without having to believe in its veracity first. Because that's something that the religious simply cannot do. But let's see what Wallace has to say.
Well, so to ask the question, you always got to ask good questions. Like, what, so if someone comes with an issue, I want to ask, well, and you probably know Greg Koukl's work.
Yes.
Okay, so Greg Koukl's done some good friend of mine. He wrote a book called Tactics. I feel like I should get a commission on every one of those ones he sells because I think I sell more books than Greg does for him.
Oh, right. This is all about money, isn't it? It's important to keep that in mind. Well, we all know about Greg and how utterly pointless he and his apologetics are, and Wallace is absolutely no better. This is really where we start to see the utter incestuous nature of Christian apologetics. It's all a bunch of people patting each other on the back because they're all trying to say the exact same thing. It isn't like science where proving someone wrong is the height of scientific credibility. These people are all trying to walk in general lockstep, at least the ones that have a common theology like the Baptists do. And it's also funny how they're all buddy-buddy with absolutely everybody else, right? But anyway, let's get past the Mutual Theological Masturbation Society and hopefully find a point.
But his book Tactics is helpful because it talks about asking 3 important questions. What do you mean by that? Why do you think that's true? And have you ever considered this alternative? That's usually your some form of the third question.
Yet, you people don't want to answer our questions when we ask the exact same thing. How do you know that? And how have you objectively tested your proposition to see if it stands up to intellectual rigor? Because I can answer every single one of those questions, and Wallace, he can't. He just can't. Not at all. Because he's relying on blind faith, and I'm working on evidence. But anyway, let's get back.
So the first question I'm going to ask is, well, why would you think this is not reliable to begin with?
Why do you think that it is? Because you're the one making the claim. You're the one that has to prove that you've got the slightest clue what it is that you're talking about. Welcome to Shifting the Burden of Proof 101. We don't have to prove you wrong. You have to prove yourself right, and faith doesn't get you anywhere useful. You need evidence, and Wallace doesn't have any. None of them do. It's why they try so desperately to push it all off on us. So, in any discussion, Wallace loses right there. Until he has something better, there's no reason whatsoever to continue. But because I'm feeling generous today, let's go see what other stupidity he can come up with.
Like, why would you think that this, I'm with you. I never thought it was reliable. Now, we didn't talk about this tonight, but how I tested the scripture was under the 4 criteria we use with eyewitnesses in trial. Were you really there to see what you said you saw? Can you be corroborated in some way? Have you changed your story over time? And do you have some bias or motive that would cause you to lie to me?
And the Bible is guilty of all of those. First, there's no evidence that any of the gospel writers were eyewitnesses to anything because all of the gospels were written anonymously. We don't know who they were, and therefore we cannot gauge their reliability in any way, shape, or form. No one else steps forward to verify any of these anonymous writers either, because there simply are no demonstrable eyewitnesses to anything. There is not one single objectively verifiable eyewitness to Jesus or anything that Jesus supposedly did, period. The names were just stapled onto the Gospels hundreds of years later by people who were just following tradition, not evidence. We also know that there are parts in the Gospels which have demonstrably changed over time, prior to the earliest copies that we have. It might not have been done by the original authors, whoever they were, but there were a lot of variations, say, in the end of Mark. Exactly what did the original manuscript of Mark say? Well, we don't know, because we don't have the original manuscript of anything. And lots of copyists don't seem consistent. Finally, the question of bias. Of course there was bias. They probably stood to gain considerable power and influence in the early church. Lying for the Lord is a tried and true religious pastime. Yet Wallace doesn't want to talk about that, does he? He just assumes that his beliefs are true without being able to prove it. No, he's just trying to push it on the opposition because it coddles his pathetic little fifis. Come on, we all know that's what's going on. Let's watch.
That's the criteria that we offer jurors to examine when we're talking about eyewitness testimony. So I simply said, well, if I apply this to the Gospels, could they pass?
Not a chance in hell. Now, he won't admit it because he's absurdly biased, as are all of the people on his side. I'm willing to bet the majority of the audience are all there, starry-eyed, gobbling this crap up, and not asking any questions because, it's sinful to doubt. You just have to believe it or you're going to hell. Well, that's just stupid. Knock it off.
Now, we didn't talk about that tonight, but that's really how, there's a bunch of stuff I had to jump through in order to become a Christian. And the first thing I had to know is, why would I trust that the scriptures are telling me anything true about Jesus? Look, let's put it this way. Go with me on a thought experiment. If the Gospels simply reported Jesus as an ancient sage who preached. That's it. No miracle working, no born of a virgin, didn't die on a cross and resurrected. None of the miracle stuff was in there. If all it was that he was a preacher in the first century, he would be the most well-documented historical preacher in the history of preachers. There wouldn't be a single person who would doubt the historicity of Jesus.
Bullshit. Complete and utter bullshit. Because the fact still remains that we have no evidence of any kind that a historical Jesus was actually real. Not one shred. This is really where you know that people like Wallace have never actually talked to a skeptical atheist, or at least we know they've never listened. We'd set them straight, but they don't care about the truth, and they've got books to sell and sheep to fleece, so they're just going to keep on going. The fact is, I have no reason whatsoever to think that a real historical Jesus, no matter what characteristics you want to attach to him, actually existed. Is it possible? Sure. Is it certain? Not a chance. And this is where the religious just run around with the goalposts and start pretending that we're somehow biased against their blind faith, and that's just wrong. We're just looking at the world as it is without having to stare through rose-colored religious goggles. I don't have to come up with a conclusion before I go looking for evidence. They do. It's why they fail so badly and look so absurd. And it's really too bad that they can't figure that out.
But you add the miracles, and now everyone's like, can't trust that stuff. That speaks to the presuppositional bias of naturalism.
No, it speaks only of a bias toward truth and reality. This is one of those places where I just roll my eyes at the religious. I'm not biased against the supernatural. You've never shown that there is any such thing as the supernatural. It's like someone trying to tell me that magic is real. Really? Prove it. Because until you can, I have no reason whatsoever to take anything that you say seriously. And the same thing goes for the supernatural. If you want me to accept it as a potential answer for anything, you have to be able to back it up in some demonstrable way, and you can't. I mean, really, if you think you can, go right ahead. I'll wait. Nobody is biased toward naturalism. We're not sitting here going, well, I'm going to arbitrarily reject anything but the natural for emotional reasons. No, we accept the natural because it's all we have any evidence for, period. We've never seen anything but the natural. And when you don't see anything but the natural, you start to think, well, maybe that's all that there is. And if you want to change our minds, prove something else is out there. Go ahead. It's all on your head. Put up or shut up.
That we are biased against the miracles. Everything else, we're like, hey, that's solid. Put the miracle in, oh, no, can't trust any of it. So that really is more about our bias than it is anything else.
Yes, it's about your bias. At least you got that right. Because we can see what's really going on here, and you're totally blinded to the real world. It's why these people ought to be ashamed of themselves, but they're not, because they really don't give a damn about the truth. Their problem, one among many, is that they start with the conclusion that they reach for entirely emotional reasons, and then they work backwards, cherry-picking data that fits in with what they already believe, while conveniently ignoring anything that doesn't. We, on the other hand, follow the evidence to the most logical conclusion that we can reach, and we don't cherry pick. We look at everything. Everything! Because we don't care how any of it makes us feel. If there were evidence for a God, I'd believe in a God. If there was evidence for a historical Jesus, I'd have no problem believing that one existed. If there was evidence for aliens and UFOs and out-of-body experiences, I would accept that those things existed. I have no problem with thinking that it's possible that some itinerant rabbi might have been wandering around Palestine 2,000 years ago. Yeah, okay, whatever. I don't care if that's what the evidence supports. That isn't what the religious need us to accept, though, and they can't seem to prove that a real guy was really there, based on evidence and reason, much less the magical man god that they require in order for their silly beliefs to be true. But, as we all know, they just don't care about that stuff, do they? They just do it because they want to feel good. And that's what makes them stupid.
But I would say to all of you, I didn't have anyone I could read when I became a Christian. I didn't know what apologetics was. So I didn't know who even the authors would be. So I started digging through church history, church fathers, early first century stuff, the stuff I've been writing about in the next book. And I would suggest to you is don't trust me for this.
You know, I think that's the first intelligent thing he said so far. Don't trust him, period. First, he's not remotely an expert on anything. I wouldn't trust this lunatic to come to a crime scene and not contaminate the evidence. That's how little I think of Wallace. But that's really advice that everyone ought to take to heart, because it doesn't matter who pushes what position, it matters only what the evidence has to say. I don't care if you're talking about Wallace or Neil deGrasse Tyson. Don't trust people. Trust data. Trust evidence. Trust what you can prove, not what you're told. And it's really a shame for the religious that the actual data doesn't support any of the crap they believe, isn't it?
Do not trust me and do not trust Craig for it. We can guide you. We can show you what we did. That's what we try to do.
You can show all of the mistakes that you made, so maybe your guidebook might show people what not to do, but it can't get you to your conclusions rationally and with evidence of forethought. That's the problem. Your journey was emotional, not intellectual. You might try to spin it as something else today so people buy your books, but your books are uneducated garbage. I know because I've read them. It's faith-based bias depending on pre-existing beliefs before you even start to examine the evidence, and that only leads you to failure. So don't listen to them, ever. You're just asking for trouble if you do.
We want to equip you, the saints, for the work of ministry. But to be equipped, you have to be knowledgeable. And so what we want to point you in the right direction. And then all that time you've been spending wondering whether or not, and reading about whether or not Dak Prescott's going to get back in the saddle, spend that studying Scripture.
Maybe you shouldn't study the Scriptures until you have sufficient evidence that the Scriptures are worth your time. Because that's what happens when you look at the evidence first and skip the blind faith. It doesn't matter what you wish was true. It doesn't matter what you want to believe. You actually have to put your sources to the test and not believe things because some book that you happen to have an emotional attachment to says so, but because that book has actually been demonstrated objectively to be reliable and historically verifiable. It doesn't matter if it caters to your fifis. It matters if it's actually true.
Because all this is about us reprioritizing the stuff that we used to think was important. And we waste so much. I mean, if you look at my podcasts, more than half are sports. That's a complete, my wife will say, why are you doing that? She teases me, you should be on that sports show as making a commentary. That's not a compliment. She's saying, you've wasted that much headspace on sports. So it's about us kind of prioritizing what's important to us.
Or what should be important, because your feelings don't actually matter to anyone but you. And that's really where religion fails, because it's making fifis a priority when none of that actually means a thing. So let's use a sports analogy for a moment. What he's doing is starting at the finish line holding the trophy. Then he's running the course backwards just so he can pick out all the interesting bits so that by the time he gets back around to the beginning, he can say, well, I won because I was already at the finish line and here are all the things that I discovered along the way. Except that's just stupid. He got the snippets that he's carefully selected so that he can pretend that he actually did some thinking to reach his conclusion, but he never actually did. He's just running around with the goalposts and playing make-believe that he accomplished anything useful. It's why all of this looks so absurdly stupid. They get up on stage in front of a bunch of fawning fans and spew their nonsense and sell their books in the lobby and pretend that they've done anything worthwhile. It's certainly not only Wallace that does this, because all of them do. It's just a scam led by scammers who might not even be aware of how badly they're ripping off their audience. Because they just don't care, do they? They're either dumb or dishonest, and maybe both. You decide. Let me know in the comments which one you think J. Warner Wallace is. I look forward to the results.
Bum